Well, the offseason is finally upon us, and the New York Mets wasted absolutely no time with free agency opening. They have signed Edwin Diaz to a 5-year, $102 million contract, the richest ever for a closer. I'll be discussing this deal on the show today, as well as the Mets' decision to pick up their option on Daniel Vogelbach. We got real news back into the flow of the offseason here with Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as a managing editor and where I wrote a free agent profile on Edwin Diaz, and I also spoke about that on the show. But in that free agent profile, which we're doing a lot of right now at Just Baseball, really kind of diving into each of the top free agents available, I predicted a contract. And with a lot of these profiles, we do landing spots. Where can these guys go? With Diaz, I said, no doubt about it, he's coming back to the Mets. That's what I put in the profile. That's what I said on the show many a time. And I also predicted a contract, 5 years, $100 million. And I also said that I thought the Mets put a 6-year option in there, so it would be a team option in the 6th year. Well, that's basically the contract he signs here. It's a little bit different, $102 million, and I had the team option being a little bit more friendly to the Mets. I had it being, it was like $15 million, I think I said, with a buyout. So in a sense, it would have been more guaranteed money for Edwin Diaz than he ultimately gets here, because I think I had a 50. Really, it's the same general premise. I mean, a little bit different. I think mine was a 15-year club option, $5 million buyout. So it would have been 105 guaranteed over 5 years. It's 102 guaranteed. And I think the breakdown from what has been reported so far is a $12 million signing bonus. So that would tell us that it's going to be, $18 million a year in salary for 5 years. That gets you to $90 million. And then that signing bonus pushes the guarantee up to that 102. For luxury tax purposes, Edwin Diaz will be coming in at $20.4 million, I believe. Let me actually make sure I have that spot on for you. Yeah, $20.4 million over the next 5 years. There's also a player option. So that's the other wrinkle to this. After the 3rd year, Edwin Diaz could opt out of his contract. And I think that, from a Mets perspective, that's actually a good thing if he were to opt out. And you're saying, if we love Edwin Diaz, why would you want him to opt out? Well, if he were to opt out, now if they end up retaining him beyond that, and this is predicting way into the future, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But I never mind an opt-out in a contract, especially if it's not an opt-out after the 1st year. Then it's really all player-centric because, hey, they can just have a great season, test free agency. In this instance, you get 3 years of Edwin Diaz now, for sure, before he decides what he wants to do. And if he does opt out, you're, losing the 2 years that you'd be the most concerned about, right? The 2 years at the end of the contract where you'd be wondering how his arm would hold up as he gets into his 30s. But, I mean, even if he was with the Mets for the entirety of this deal, you're talking about his age 29 through age 33 seasons. And then you have an option on his age 34 season. So I love this deal for the New York Mets. And, we can maybe dive into the numbers a bit, but I don't think the numbers matter when you have Steve Cohen's money. I really don't think that is that big of an impact here, because this is an owner that is committed to paying the luxury tax probably until the Mets win a World Series and even beyond that potentially. He is very willing to spend. It seems like he's going to blow past that $290 million Cohen tax this year and have a very rich payroll, and this is the first step towards that. And as a fan, you got to be thrilled, because in the past, you wouldn't retain a guy like Edwin Diaz. You would let him, perform his entire career in a Mets uniform, or, well, if it was a homegrown guy. But, if you acquired him, you let him, perform all those cheap years. And then you would have traded him in his final year, or you would have just let it ride out, extended him a qualifying offer, and moved beyond that. The Mets bypassed the qualifying offer. They jumped straight to the contract here, and you now know you're the best closer in baseball, locked up for 5 more seasons. And when you think about where the Mets are going and what's their plans for the upcoming season, like now this gives you a bedrock, a big foundation in one of the biggest areas of flux on this team, because when it comes to a Brandon Nimmo's free agency, as we've been discussing, that's kind of the only real hole that could be created offensively with this team, because everyone else is basically coming back, and it's guys coming back from a team that was a top 5 offense in baseball pretty clearly, and a team that won 101 games. So you feel pretty good about that. The rotation and the bullpen are the biggest concerns at this point, and I think at least in the rotation, you still know that regardless of what happens with your free agents, there's depth there. There's depth with obviously still having Scherzer as a big anchor, but having David Peterson, Tyler McGill, Joey Lucchesi, there's still some arms, and they're most likely your back-end depth arms, but at least there's something to start with. The bullpen, it was Drew Smith and basically nothing. So now you have Edwin Diaz locked in, and I just think this makes the rest of building out a bullpen so much easier, because you now know you have the guy you need at the end of games. You want to find the replacement for Adam Ottavino and for Seth Lugo. If not just retaining those guys, by all means, you have to do that. But it would have been really, really hard to replace Edwin Diaz in free agency. And that's why this was a no-brainer. That's why I'm thrilled the Mets have made this decision. But I want to go through what else this means for their offseason next year. Could we see some more signings early? And then we'll close the show today on the other news of the day, which is Daniel Vogelbach coming back. Before we get to any of that, though, BetOnline.net is your number one source for football betting info this season. This is where you can find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Now, before we get back to the big news in Mets land, which is the signing of Edwin Diaz, I feel like I probably buried the lead a little bit in that we're in the second segment and have yet to say that the World Series is over. Look, if you want World Series coverage, Locked on MLB is a good place to find it. Locked on Astros, Locked on Phillies, by all means. Not necessarily where my focus has been. I've been watching the games. It was a great series. I was hoping the Phillies would lose, and they did. So we're happy now, right? As great as this magical run was for the Phillies, they did not get that World Series championship. The Braves were eliminated not long after the Mets by that Phillies team, and guess what? We go into next season. Everyone is in the exact same place that they were before the year when it comes to championships. So fine by me. You move past it, and with this signing that the Mets have just made to retain Edwin Diaz, it's clear they're going for it, which we knew, before we even got into the offseason. We've known that Steve Cohen will continue to spend and continue to reinvest in this ball club, but it's always great to see it. It's always fun. That's what makes the offseason and even the trade deadline at times now where transactions are, the big story. It makes the Mets this premier franchise because they're in the mix for all these guys. And that's the beautiful thing here. I love this move to re-sign Edwin Diaz, though. And I love that they did it, about an hour after, it was available to them. The window opens where you can negotiate with your players. Essentially, things start to happen. You see, player options being declined, team options being picked up, all these different things going on around the league. And there's only one team that has signed a player to a significant contract already, and that's the New York Mets with Edwin Diaz. The New York Yankees right now could give Aaron Judge a $400 million contract and make sure he signs. But they aren't, and they probably won't, because that's not usually how this thing works. It's very rare that we see teams take that 5-day window to negotiate and actually come to terms with their player. And it leads me to wonder, is there another signing down the pike here? Could we see Brandon Nimmo or Edwin Diaz. or Edwin Diaz? Wow. Could we see Brandon Nimmo join Edwin Diaz or Jacob deGrom join Edwin Diaz to re-sign before they actually hit the open market? That's certainly a possibility. I think with deGrom maybe slightly more likely than Nimmo, because I feel like the Mets are in a position right now with Nimmo where you let him hit the open market and there's a chance he could fall back to you. You know what I mean? There's a chance, depending on what other teams are out there, that whatever Scott Boras' asking price is for him right now, not to say it would be moved drastically off of that number, but if they shop that number around and no team is biting on it, well, then maybe there's going to be a chance we can get him at a little bit better of a contract. With Jacob deGrom, I feel like you have to meet his demands to a certain extent, and I also feel like that's going to be a really creative, structured contract. So I do wonder if the Mets were to approach him with a deal that was fair, where he's maybe making $40 million a year. Would they be able to get him signed before he hit that actual open market? I think there's a chance here that happens. But Diaz was always the easiest one. Diaz was always the one that we felt like was going to happen. And he wanted to come back. He wanted to be a Met again, and he's back. And I think he's a big part of this new identity of what this ball club is trying to be. You're trying to become a perennial contender where you're winning year after year after year. And Edwin Diaz has become a big part of not only winning, but just kind of the ethos of this team, the way that they win baseball games, building that narrative and that emotion and that trigger around his entrance music, where the more that the mystique of it grows, if he goes out next season and he posts a 1.50 ERA and he strikes out, 45% of the batters that he faces, and he's looking just as dominant as he was this year, maybe he even gets more saves next year. Maybe he gets close to that 57 number he put up with the Mariners before the Mets traded for him. And it just starts to snowball. That thought or that fear that an opposing team will have when they get to the ninth inning and they're not winning and they're in Citi Field and and then the music playing and the crowd gets into it, it's just this sinking, demoralizing, we got no shot type feeling. And the Mets are building something special with that. And so they needed to bring this guy back. And yes, you could say it's a lot of money, because it is. It is a lot of money. At the same time, Aroldis Chapman was at 17.2 off the top of my head for his AAV. And that was over a 5-year deal. I think it was 86, I believe. Liam Hendricks was essentially 3 for 54, so $18 million there. He gets $18 million a year based on base salary, which is about on line with past relievers, plus the signing bonus that pushes him over the 20 a year. And he gets that 6-year option. So yeah, this is a rich contract, but I don't think it's a gross overpay by any stretch of the imagination. I think there's other teams that would have met that $100 million asking price for Edwin Diaz. Maybe it would have been structured a little bit more creatively, but I think they would have got there. And I think quibbling over $5-10 million over the course of a 5-year deal with Edwin Diaz, it would just risk potentially losing him. And again, based on what's on this roster, you just couldn't afford it, because there's nothing else in the bullpen right now outside of Drew Smith. It's Edwin Diaz, Drew Smith. Maybe Bryce, Montes de Aca has a shot. We were discussing on the last episode, Grant Hartwig. These are guys who are not proven. You needed that proven reliever. You got him. Now it's, what do you do with Trevor May, Seth Lugo, Adam Ottavino, or any of these guys interested in coming back, and what's that number going to be? But with Diaz as your backbone, you can finally build a bullpen, but now you can actually shop a little bit more cost effectively, where you're not chasing your tail if Diaz signs elsewhere and suddenly you're overpaying for Kenley Jansen, and now you're trusting Jansen to be your closer. When we saw, he might still be good, but he's certainly on the wrong side of his prime. And I think the same can be said for Chapman and also for Craig Kimbrell. And outside of those guys, you're looking at Robert Suarez from the Padres as really the only other premier talent when it comes to the reliever market, and Suarez wasn't a closer this year. So, whether it was Adam Ottavino or any of these other guys you could have signed, like there was not another option in free agency that you would say was a lockdown closer. There was one guy on the market that I viewed as a complete lockdown, all-star type closing pitcher that can come out and win you a game that you can trust against the best hitters in baseball, and you're not scared when he takes that mound. That is worth every penny of what he's getting, particularly when you're playing with monopoly money, as Steve Cohen has. And that's also why it was the biggest slam dunk in the world that they would pick up Daniel Vogelbach's option. We'll discuss that to close out the show today because that is the other transaction that is official. Vogie is back. All right, so here we are, first day of the offseason. Two moves have been made, Daniel Vogelbach and Edwin Diaz. I did a podcast, I guess it was maybe 2 or 3 days after the Mets season ended, who had just played their last game with the New York Mets. Something along those lines. It's the phrasing of that. I had two guys that I guaranteed would be back in a Mets uniform. Daniel Vogelbach and Edwin Diaz. Here we are. Diaz, it was because it just seemed like an inevitability that they would come to terms on a deal, and it didn't even take 24 hours into free agency for that to happen. Vogelbach is a $1.5 million option, and I saw Sal Licata of SNY tweet out, Why? That guy has some of the worst takes on the Mets that you're going to find. The same guy that said the division was wrapped up in May, and the Mets ultimately lose the division to the Braves this year. So he thinks the Mets should have, turned down Daniel Vogelbach's option for $1.5 million. When you just gave a closer, 2 hours later, $20.4 million a year on luxury tax, you're concerned about 1.5. That's a rounding error when it comes to this team's payroll. And we forget that Vogelbach was, amazing with the Mets. And you're going to say, amazing, Ryan, you're crazy. The guy had a 144 WRC plus. Again, that measure is based on a league average of 100, 44% better than your league average hitter. If that stat doesn't work for you, how about this one? He got on base at a 393 clip. How many guys are going to get on base at a damn near 400 clip? It's not many. And I'm not saying Vogelbach is the sole answer at the DH position. I still think the Mets could go out and they could get a Jose Abreu and make this signing or this, bringing back a little bit, less essential, where you might have an everyday DH and a Jose Abreu. And so where do you find at bats for Vogelbach? Guess what you do then? You trade him. It's $1.5 million, or you retain him. He's a left-handed bat if you're a bench, and you might need him because Abreu is in his mid-30s and he could break down, or Alonso could end up going down, and a million things can happen over the course of 162 games. There was no reason not to pick up Daniel Vogelbach's option. It made perfect sense. Is he going to go out and hit 30 home runs next season with the Mets? No, I don't expect that. He did hit 30 home runs in 2019. I don't think he'll get the playing time to do that, and I don't expect it. But will Daniel Vogelbach across a full season hit 15, 20 bombs and semi-regular playing time and get on base at a 375 clip? I think that is a very reasonable ask from this guy. And look, the Mets lineup did clearly get better when they got Daniel Vogelbach at the trade deadline. It did. So I thought it was the biggest no-brainer of this offseason for the Mets. Diaz might have been the second one, and they get both of those things done. And now you sort of look ahead to what could happen this week. Chris Bassett has declined or is planning to decline his mutual option, so he will be a free agent. But there's every chance the Mets will extend the qualifying offer to him, and he really they really should, because at $19.56 million for 1 year, you really can't go wrong with Chris Bassett. If he accepts, by all means, great. If he declines, draft pick compensation if he signs elsewhere. So that's on the table. And I could even see the two sides, now that the option's been declined, before the Mets officially give him the QO, I could see them negotiating right now. Maybe that is a contract that's more likely to get done than we're even imagining. Maybe that's more likely than DeGrom or Nimmo. I don't know. It's a possibility. You have Nimmo and DeGrom. Both will get extended the qualifying offer. Both will decline it if they reach that point. And then beyond that, everyone else becomes a free agent pretty much without the QO. There's nobody else that the Mets would extend it to. I don't think they're extending it to Taijuan Walker. Obviously, if they didn't pick up Carrasco's option, no way would they be giving him a qualifying offer for more. That would be obviously ludicrous. So, yeah, at this point, that's what we're probably waiting on. That's maybe the next shoe that will drop. What they're going to do with Carrasco. Will he be a free agent? Will they bring him back for what's essentially $11 million, a $14 million option, $3 million buyout? So the net difference there is 11. That's certainly something that could happen or could have happened as I'm recording right now, but could happen over the next couple of days. And then we'll just see where things stand with those other two free agents in DeGrom and Nimmo and even Bassett, what they do as far as the QO, and if those guys were to accept or decline, and then, if they actually do ultimately reach the open market, where the Mets would move from there. But a great first step for this team. You now know who your closer is, you know who a lot of your starting lineup is, and you know that you have one of your aces at least. With Max Scherzer, the Mets are in a very good place already as they start to look towards the 2023 season. But that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter, @Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show, @Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On Sports Today, hosted by Peter Bukowski. Locked On Sports Today is where you want to go to find out about all the latest around the sports world, whether that's game reactions, breaking news, hot takes of the day. Peter Bukowski has you covered. You can follow Locked On Sports Today wherever you get podcasts on the Odyssey app or YouTube.